When one thinks or talks about the martial law period in our country, a lot of us will probably not associate it with anything that has to do specifically with feminism or a feminist movement. Sure, we have heard of Liliosa Hilao in Lagim's first installment of the martial law series, or you may have heard of Tish Pascual Ladlad, Maria Cristina Bawagan, May Versola Rodriguez, Loretta Ann Rosales, Trinidad Herrera, Coronacion Waling-Waling Chiva, or Elma Villaron Tangente, alias Dalama. All badass Filipinas who fought against the dictatorship and the oppression that resulted from it. We never really stop and think about what that period meant specifically for women and our struggles, or better said, their specific struggle at that time. However, the women of the late 60s, the 70s, and 80s knew exactly what issues needed to be highlighted, issues that usually became invisible to allow the greater cause of overthrowing a dictatorship and empowering the poor and marginalized to take priority. What most feminists during the martial law era recognized was that the fight against women's oppression was deeply intertwined with the fight for the entire working class, a very Marxist-inspired thought that permeated some of the earlier grassroots movements spearheaded by women. This simply means that no movement to overthrow Marcos and no demand for reform can ever be made without specifically highlighting and demanding the eradication of that extra layer of exploitation and oppression that women go through under a fascist regime. This was the realization and the resulting cause of one extraordinary woman whose life was short but solely dedicated to empower the poor, the marginalized, and the women amongst them. This is the case of Lorrie Barros. Mabuhay LagimFam, welcome to another episode of Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast, and to the second installment of the martial law series for this season. Thank you for tuning back in and for the lovely feedback on the previous episode. As always, in case you didn't know, I try to release an episode every other Friday, even though it has been chaotic a little bit on that front. Generally, I do try to release 2 episodes a month, but it can sometimes just be one, and I do let the LagimFam know when that happens on social media. If you want to follow me on social media, I am mostly on Instagram and Twitter, or as it is now known, X. But you can also follow me on Facebook and TikTok. I have also subscribed to Threads, but I've not done so much on that front just yet. So please make sure to scroll and find the show notes to find all the links to my social media accounts. If you want to support my content, I do have a buymecoffee.com account where you can make donations. The link to that is also in the show notes, so please make sure to check that out or go through my link tree on my Instagram bio. Now, without further ado, let us dive right into today's case. As always, please note that details in this case might be triggering to some people, so please take care of yourselves whilst listening. The new Filipina is one who can stay whole days and nights with striking workers, learning from them the social realities which her bourgeois education has kept from her. More important, this means she has convinced her parents of the seriousness of her commitment to the workers' and peasants' cause, a commitment which requires all sorts of behavior previously way beyond the bounds of respectable womanhood. She is a woman who has discovered the exalting realm of responsibility, a woman fully engaged in the making of history. That is a direct quote from one of the many writings of Maria Lorena Barros, better known as Lorrie Barros. Having read a little bit about her life at this point, I think Lorrie, in that quote I just read out, was describing the new Filipina as much as she was addressing her younger self about her older self. Lorrie Barros was born in Baguio on the 18th of March 1948. Her father was Romeo Barros, and her mother was Alicia Morelos, who was quite a remarkable woman herself. It is said that Alicia was a member of the Hukbalahap, a communist guerrilla movement that was formed by farmers in northern Luzon to primarily fight against the Japanese occupation during World War II. Lorrie was a naturally curious and inquisitive child, and this was encouraged in the home she grew up in. She was a consistent honor student at her grade school and high school, where she honed her creative writing skills not only as a writer but also as the editor-in-chief of her high school paper. By the time she graduated from high school, she had won at least one gold medal for writing. It was no surprise to anyone that after a successful academic run in grade school and then in high school, Lorrie ended up being admitted to an anthropology program at the University of the Philippines. She graduated in 1970 with cum laude honors and then went directly into a master's program at the same university. On the side, she would also work as a teacher and continued to write, eventually seeing her works in various publications. She preferred poems and short stories over anything else, especially over scholarly writing. She loved acting in stage plays and was very much that bohemian college girl that we picture in our heads when we think of 1970s University of the Philippines. And whilst her mom might not have approved of this, Lorrie knew that she was going through something really important and special at this point. One blog post by the Martial Law Files described Lorrie's experience as a period of self-revelation, a process of soul-searching, but most importantly, it was the start of Lorrie's student activism. Right off the bat, Lorrie got involved in protests, rallies, and community actions on issues such as the Vietnam War or the never-ending issue of poverty, especially in the rural areas of the Philippines. Lorrie was by no means rich, and she did not grow up spoiled. She knew how it was to have little money, and even during her UP days, she experienced hardships that were only slightly alleviated by the fact that she received grants for being a scholar, and by the fact that she worked as a part-time teaching assistant. Now, by 1969, Lorrie joined the SDK or Samahang Demokratiko ng Kabataan, an organization who believed that societal change could only come through radical action. On top of all the rallies she joined, she also took part in so-called exposure trips to talk and live amongst poor farmers and workers who she also supported at the picket lines. During these college years, Lorrie understood the systems that were in place that also prevented the most marginalized and impoverished in our society from not only living a comfortable life, but also from getting justice for all the injustices that were committed against this section of society. She came to believe that, quote, colonial mentality had been so deeply ingrained in the Filipinos by their colonizers, and that capitalism in the Philippines was yet another form of obeisance to a dominant foreign power, end of quote. With this came a devastating belief by Lorrie that when you really think about it, the Filipino people were and are not truly free. Lorrie wanted to expand her understanding of this and everything that she had been seeing on her exposure trips and rallies. She consumed lots of philosophical and political literature and was convinced that the only way for the masses to be uplifted from their current plight was to have a government with power that is derived from the people, and that this power could never be possessed by only a select privileged few. Whilst this was and still is not super groundbreaking given the situation the Philippines found itself in back then and how that situation is still largely unchanged today, Lorrie did realize something else, and that is the role of women. She was once quoted saying, "We are suffering from a feudal sense of values in which women are considered adjuncts of the home, for the children, for the kitchen, and for the bed. We are not trying to put down these traditional roles. We just want more active involvement from the Filipino women." End of quote. This realization led Lorrie to eventually found the group MAKIBAKA, or Malayang Kilusan ng Bagong Kababaihan, in July 1969. There is no doubt that MAKIBAKA was way ahead of its time in the Philippines. It was a militant revolutionary group that was, of course, leftist, and it centered the role of women in the class struggle. It was Lorrie and the group's belief that if women were not liberated from the traditional Filipino societal expectations and oppression, then there could never be true and complete freedom for the Filipino people. And it is difficult to disagree with this. It was an idea and ideology that raised eyebrows and led the group to stage a protest during the 1970 Miss Philippines beauty pageant. They gained more followers and support afterwards, organizing even more demos, creating chapters all throughout the country, including in factories, villages, and schools. But MAKIBAKA was so much more than that. They reached out to the impoverished and marginalized by offering aid, especially to women who were experiencing immense hardships. Lorrie headed all these actions while still being a student at UP. At this point, you can probably imagine that Lorrie's path was kind of set for her already. She was never going into politics or mainstream writing or into the corporate world. Lorrie knew too much and had seen too much of the societal ills that plagued our country. When she graduated, she refused to even attend the ceremonies and instead protested the, quote, colonially tainted and elitist Philippine education system, end of quote. This was 1970. The next year, after Ferdinand Marcos Sr. suspended the writ of habeas corpus, Lorrie became a target along with some 63 other student leaders who were all charged with subversion. MAKIBAKA was eventually classified as an illegal group by the government, which forced it to go underground amidst intense crackdowns on groups like theirs during the martial law era afterwards. Lorrie, just like many who dared to be the voices of dissent during that time, needed to lay low and escape to the countryside to keep themselves safe and to also allow themselves to continue working for the cause. Now, despite laying low, Lorrie managed to write back home, taking all necessary precautions when doing so. She told her mother that she met a young man who used to be a political science major at UP and how he and Lorrie had gotten married. Felix Rivera was a commander of the New People's Army or NPA, and as such was also in hiding. The couple wed not long after, but this wedded bliss would not last long when Felix was killed during an encounter in Isabela in 1971. This was a lot to take on for Lorrie at such a young age too. After Felix was killed, Lorrie passed on her leadership of MAKIBAKA to someone else and channeled her grief and pain into her writing, and by going deeper underground, still continuing her community organizing work. She was not one to give up. She kept going. At this point, she remained in Isabela and further built communities in that region, eventually meeting a former professor by the name of Ramon Sanchez while she was organizing a propaganda conference that aimed to use art and literature as tools for the revolution. The two fell in love and eventually married. Sanchez, prior to meeting Lorrie, had left behind his life in academia to take up arms and become a commander within the NPA. Their wedding ceremony took place in northern Isabela, and by November 1972, the two welcomed their first and only child, Ramon Emiliano Sanchez, fondly called Emil. Life as a new mother was not easy for Lorrie. On top of not always being able to be with her new husband and the father of her son, Lorrie had many close calls with the military who was trying to capture her. Being on the run was a constant in her life then. According to a profile written by the Human Rights Violations Victims Memorial Commission, Lorrie and Emil's hideout was raided one night, and she had to carry her baby whilst also attempting to jump over a 7-foot fence to escape her potential captors. That night, she kept herself and Emil safe, but she also knew that she could not inflict this kind of life on Emil any longer. He deserved better. It was a heartbreaking decision, therefore, when Lorrie decided to leave her only child with an aunt. Now, just to be clear, Lorrie at this point was not a part of the NPA, although some may believe or may have believed otherwise back then. She was only initiated into the NPA in 1973 and was then directed to head to Bicol to become a political instructor. This was in August of 1973. 3 months later, Lorrie was captured by the military in Sorsogon, and to make matters worse, she was pregnant with her second child. After she was captured, she was brought to and detained in Canlubang, Laguna. There, she suffered a miscarriage that brought to her life yet another great loss and tragedy. A few months following her miscarriage, she was transferred to a rehabilitation center in Fort Bonifacio in May 1974. Up until this point, her identity remained concealed, meaning the military did not know that they managed to capture one of the many student activists wanted by the government a couple years back. By 1974, however, her cover was blown. But that never held Lorrie back from fighting against the oppressive powers, and so, whilst imprisoned, she joined her fellow detainees in protesting the horrible prison conditions they found themselves in, even going so far as to conduct hunger strikes to demand their release. Also, whilst in prison, Lorrie was able to be with her son Emil for a very short time before having to hand him back to his carers at that time. Sadly, it was around this time as well that Lorrie received devastating news concerning her husband, Ramon. As it turned out, Ramon surrendered to the military and was said to have started cooperating with them following his arrest. This hurt Lorrie immensely, but it also fueled the fire in her to continue her work and, as one blog post put it, repair the damages her former husband had done. For her plans to come to fruition, though, she needed to get out first. Remember, she was still being detained. And out Lorrie went. On the 1st of November 1974, Lorrie and 5 other prisoners used the heavy rains on that day as their cover to finally make a run for it. From the prison, Lorrie was able to rejoin the NPA in Quezon Province. For almost 2 years after her escape, Lorrie worked tirelessly whilst evading the military, as she was, in every sense of the word, a fugitive. But things were not looking good within the NPA, and Lorrie would talk about this in her letters and poetry. Morale was low within the NPA. Some of Lorrie's comrades had been killed and or captured, which hurt their cause immensely. The details of these comrades' deaths were harrowing, with some of them being tortured first before being executed in groups. Lorrie, according to one report, tried her best to boost morale, but privately she also felt the impact of these deaths, talking about a whale trying to swallow her in her sleep. All this was probably an ominous foreboding as to what would happen soon after. On the 23rd of March 1976, just before dawn, Lorrie found herself surrounded by the military. Some sources would later say that Lorrie had actually been warned that a comrade who was captured by the military may have confessed and told the military about her whereabouts, leading to the raid later on. As per this account, Lorrie refused to move locations despite the warning, but told everyone else to leave their location. Once surrounded by the military, Lorrie was alone. The military then started their attack, but this is where things get a bit muddled because there are a couple of different accounts as to how Lorrie was attacked. In their profile on Lorrie, the Human Rights Violations Victims Memorial Commission cites at least 3 versions. Firstly, there is Lorrie's sister's account. Ramona shared that Lorrie was initially spotted in a hut, after which the military then opened fire in her direction. Lorrie was hit, and although members of the military tried to get her help afterwards, she succumbed to her wounds on the way to a nearby military camp. Lorrie's profile at the Bantayog ng mga Bayani is not very detailed about the circumstances of her death, but it sounds slightly similar to Ramona's version. It would seem that according to that profile, Lorrie was involved in an encounter where she was badly wounded and then captured in Cagsiay, Mabuan, Quezon. It would seem that in exchange for information that would truly betray her comrades and the cause she had consistently fought for over 6 years, the military supposedly offered her medical assistance and a chance to survive her wounds from the encounter, But because she was Lorrie Barros, she refused to give in and give up. She allegedly told her captors that she'd rather die for what she believed in. Following this, someone from the military shot her in the nape of her neck, killing her instantly. Lorrie's mom also has a different account of how her daughter died. According to Alicia, she was told by the commanding officer of the squad that led the encounter with Lorrie that they first ordered her to surrender, but instead of complying, Lorrie opened fire. What followed was a gunfight that ended with Lorrie being shot in the head, but with her not instantly dying. She supposedly managed to escape to some nearby bushes, after which some soldiers ran after her and found her bleeding. As she was dying, she supposedly said, "You were lucky to be alive. My gun jammed." Fierce as ever. With her last breath, she allegedly asked the soldiers to let her die for her beliefs. Lorrie was only 28 years old when she died, and although we may never know the real circumstances surrounding her death, one thing remains sure. Lorrie was unfailing in her beliefs and convictions. I know that some listeners may squirm uncomfortably in their seats right now because of the fact that Lorrie was part of the NPA, a militant group that has been made public enemy number one by the government since its inception. And whilst I do not want to minimize and sugarcoat the damage and violence the NPA have inflicted purposefully and unwittingly on some fellow kababayan over the years, given its own evolution as a group, I also cannot deny that their existence and presence in our society is a result of systemic corruption and oppression by the powers that be in our government, amongst many other things, of course. Lorrie was steadfast in her love for her country and saw no other way but to support the act of taking up arms against government entities like the military. Lorrie saw the hardships of her fellow Filipinos. She saw the oppression, she noticed the role of women being diminished, and she lived during a time when a single peep of dissent could get you killed. Lorrie's actions and decisions were also a direct result of whatever made the NPA the NPA. So joining the NPA as an ultimate act of rebellion against the Marcos regime was inevitable for someone like Lorrie who wanted to see a better future for her country. I really need people to understand context and nuances properly when viewing the actions of people like Lorrie. Having said all that, she remains a hero of mine, and in sharing her story with you, I'm hoping that I can help in preserving her legacy. To end this episode, I leave you with the words of Alicia, Lorrie's mom, who wrote about her daughter's last moments on the 24th of March 1976, as told to her by members of the military, giving us a few more details about how Lorrie died. March 24th, 1976, early dawn. There were unusual, stealthy sounds, and Lorrie rushed to the door of the hut and whistled the prearranged signal of dispersal and escape, and in the process was shot all over the body. All her companions escaped unhurt. Her family tried to claim her body at once, but it being a weekend, all the corresponding offices were closed. The military gave her a decent burial because even they admired her courage. Commander Mila, who had given them so much trouble, was no more. This is Lorrie, the woman, wife, mother, and leader. She will live on, and there will be more like her. There must be, because only through them will the country be able to stand erect and truly free. This is Lorrie the baby, whose lullaby song was Bayan Ko. Lorrie, the little girl who always had compassion in her heart for the beggars and stray waifs in the streets. Lorrie, the adolescent raised to awareness of her country's sorry plight. Lorrie, the sweet girl so soft-spoken until she raised her voice to shout, "MAKIBAKA." This Lorrie, daughter, sister, and friend to many. Lorrie, the sweetheart, wife, mother, and comrade will be resurrected only when there's true freedom in our country. LagimFam, thank you so much again for listening to yet another episode of Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. As always, I hope you found this episode valuable and or interesting. If you do, make sure to rate and review my podcast on Apple and Spotify because it does help with making my podcast more visible to those who do not know about it yet. Also, make sure to follow me on all my socials. Check the show notes for all the links to my Insta, Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook accounts. Until next episode, thank you so much, Lagim Fam. Maraming salamat and mabuhay.